Ever wonder if the reality you inhabit is the same one everyone else sees? Or maybe how powerful forces might subtly sculpt our very perception of truth? Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive. We're looking into how reality is actually defined, influenced, and sometimes, well, outright manipulated. We're going to explore that intricate dance between power, knowledge, and what we all believe.
Yeah, and we'll be synthesizing insights from quite a few angles. We've got a critical look at Herman and Chomsky's manufacturing consent. Then there's a deep dive into the psychology and the real-world impact of conspiracy theories, plus a philosophical piece drawing on George Orwell's prescient warnings about objective reality. And finally, an analysis of this whole post-truth era we seem to be in.
Okay, so our mission here is to give you a kind of roadmap, a shortcut to understanding these, frankly, profound dynamics. We want to help you cut through all the noise out there and recognize the often hidden mechanisms shaping what we consider true. Right, let's just dive in. Let's unpack this right from the start. When we even talk about objective reality or truth, what are we actually getting at? I mean, is there a single shared reality out there for everyone, or is it really all subjective?
That's a fundamental question, isn't it? Some philosophical viewpoints actually suggest there might be no objective mind-independent reality at all, or perhaps that our senses just aren't capable of truly perceiving it if it does exist. The argument kind of goes that what appears to us, well, that's all there is. And if you take that view to its extreme, it can challenge really basic concepts, like, say, perceptual illusions. Because if there's no objective standard to deviate from, how can anything be an illusion?
Wow, that's a disorienting thought. So, okay, if we run with that idea that there's no objective truth, no shared reality, how dangerous could that get for society, I mean?
Well, George Orwell, with almost chilling foresight, he warned that these kinds of denials of objective reality are profoundly dangerous, really dangerous. They risk suppressing a person's ability to just see and think freely. They ultimately dislocate their entire sense of the world. And this directly foreshadows his terrifying vision in 1984, where truth is simply, well, whatever the party says it is.
Right, and that's where it gets really, really unsettling.
Mhm.
Orwell's vision in 1984 illustrates exactly that, what happens when the very existence of objective reality is systematically denied.
Yeah, what's truly striking is how Orwell depicts Big Brother. It's not just about physical surveillance watching what you do. It's about trying to penetrate the few cubic centimeters inside your skull, as he put it. The party's ultimate goal, its endgame, was to force absolute belief that 2 plus 2 made 5. Just crush the validity of experience, deny the very existence of external reality. He famously called the heresy of heresies just common sense.
And this idea he had, doublethink, you know, holding two contradictory beliefs at the same time, genuinely believing deliberate lies while somehow also knowing they're untrue, that feels central to his warning. It sounds less like a concept and more like a psychological weapon, really.
It absolutely is. Orwell saw this as a deliberate strategy by those in power, a way to dislocate the sense of reality, the goal being to make people just give up trying to think for themselves. He showed how certain philosophical stances, like relativism, where objective truth doesn't exist, it's all just opinions, and constructivism, where beliefs are seen as purely socially or linguistically created, how these can actually pave the way for a post-truth era, an era filled with alternative facts and fake news. The deeper problem isn't just the lies themselves, but making people so uncertain, or maybe just apathetic about truth itself, that they basically surrender their decision-making to whoever's the dominant authority.
Okay, so if reality can be manipulated like that, at such a fundamental level, how does that actually play out? How does it manifest in our mass media, for example? Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model, you mentioned that. Sounds like a powerful lens for understanding this better.
Exactly. Delving into that, their model argues that what we often celebrate as a free press isn't really free in the way we might think. It's structurally influenced and often used by powerful elites. They lay out evidence that information passes through 5 crucial filters before it even gets close to the audience.
5 filters. That's a strong claim. Can you walk us through some of those? How will we spot them in action?
Sure. Absolutely. First, just think about the sheer size and ownership of media organizations. They're often huge corporations, right? Part of larger conglomerates. Second, advertising. It's the primary source of revenue for most commercial media. So advertisers' interests can profoundly shape the content, sometimes subtly, sometimes not. Third, the media's dependence on official sources. Government press releases, corporate PR departments. This dependence effectively limits the range of narratives presented. Fourth, you have flak agencies. This means things like organized negative responses, campaigns, funding cuts, legal threats, basically ways to discipline the media and keep them within a permitted spectrum of debate. And finally, there's usually a dominant control mechanism. Historically, they argue it was things like anti-communism, but that's evolved. Now it might be the war on terror, Islamophobia, or even how certain nations like Russia or China are consistently portrayed as villains today.
It sounds like these filters, taken together, almost pre-screen reality for us. They decide what stories even become newsworthy in the first place and consistently favor the interests of those who, well, fund the media or hold political power.
Precisely. That's the core argument. And the authors illustrate this really vividly with what they call worthy versus unworthy victims. Think about the difference in coverage. You might see extensive empathetic reporting on, say, a Polish priest murdered in communist Poland, an enemy state, but then compare that to the often minimal or even absent coverage of assassinations of key figures like archbishops or labor leaders in U.S. allied countries, maybe like El Salvador or Guatemala back in the day. Or another example, how the U.S. media largely ignored the massive U.S. bombing campaigns in Cambodia in 1969, but then later heavily covered the atrocities during the Pol Pot era, or how criticism of the Vietnam War in the mainstream press only really ramped up after major business figures and parts of Washington started to disapprove. It just powerfully demonstrates how certain truths get distorted or sometimes just vanish from public view entirely.
Yeah, that model certainly makes you rethink, well, everything you read and hear, definitely. And speaking of questioning reality, let's switch gears slightly to conspiracy theories. How do they fit into this landscape of, constructed or contested realities?
It's an interesting piece of the puzzle. It's important first to distinguish a conspiracy theory from an actual real conspiracy, which definitely happened. A conspiracy theory is more an explanation that blames an event on some powerful, sinister group, often secretly manipulating things. And this explanation is usually offered when other, simpler, more probable explanations exist. What makes them particularly resilient, kind of sticky, is their internal consistency, often, and how they're designed to resist falsification. What I mean is, evidence against the theory, or even a complete lack of evidence for it, can be cleverly reinterpreted by believers as actually being proof of the conspiracy, proof of the cover-up. It often shifts from being a testable hypothesis to becoming more like a matter of faith.
Right. So, if you show someone who's convinced the moon landing was faked, clear photographic evidence or scientific data, they might just turn around and say, well, yeah, of course you have that evidence. That's exactly what the conspirators would create to fool us.
Exactly that. It's classic circular reasoning. And there's a term for it, epistemic self-insulation. It's like they build an intellectual fortress around the belief. Nothing contradictory can get in. And they often exploit well-known cognitive biases like confirmation bias, seeking out information that confirms what you already believe. They can also cleverly take advantage of things like false balance in the media, demanding equal airtime for their viewpoint, as if it's just another equally valid perspective, while conveniently ignoring the lack of actual evidence for their claims.
So what is the appeal then? What's the deep draw for people? Why do so many seem to latch onto these theories?
Well, research suggests it can be driven by a few things. Sometimes it's a fundamental search for meaning in a chaotic world. Or it could be fueled by strong feelings of fear, uncertainty, or maybe feeling powerless, out of control. Conspiracy theories often offer appealingly simple explanations for complex, frightening events. They tend to divide the world very sharply into good versus evil, clear heroes, clear villains. And, crucially, they often grant believers a sense of having special secret knowledge that the ignorant masses, the sheeple, lack. It can be quite empowering in a way. However, and this is important, belief in them is also consistently linked to things like deep distrust of authority, political cynicism, and even pathways towards radicalization. And they can have incredibly serious real-world consequences. We've seen tragic examples like AIDS denialism in South Africa, which researchers estimate contributed to around 330,000 unnecessary deaths, or the rejection of vital food aid during a famine in Zambia based purely on conspiracy theories about genetically modified foods being harmful.
Wow. Okay, it really sounds like we're navigating a truly precarious spot right now, where the very fabric of truth feels like it's under constant assault. I mean, the concept of post-truth itself was even named Oxford Dictionary's Word of the Year back in 2016. How did we actually get here, and what does it really mean for society?
Looking at the bigger picture, this post-truth era where alternative facts can seemingly replace actual facts and where feelings or personal beliefs often seem to way more heavily than objective evidence. This profoundly impacts the very foundation of our core institutions. Things like civil society, democracy itself, the rule of law, they all depend on a shared acceptance of factual truth to function properly. And a major contributor to this erosion, perhaps surprisingly to some, might be the underlying institutional logic of capitalism itself.
Capitalism. Okay, that connection isn't immediately obvious to me. How does our economic system tie into post-truth thinking?
Well, think about capitalism's core logic. It revolves around accumulation making profit and the commodification of human activity, which basically means it's constantly trying to convert everything, actions, interactions, even ideas and identities into something that can be bought and sold, something with a monetary price tag. Now, to create demand for all these goods and services, society increasingly engages in what you could call meaning manufacture. Think about advertising, for instance. It doesn't just sell a car, it sells status, freedom, identity, aspiration attached to that car brand. It manufactures meaning around the product. Now, this meaning manufacture, which used to be mainly the domain of traditional mass media like TV and print, is now democratized and massively amplified by social media. Anyone can potentially create and rapidly disseminate facts or compelling narratives or emotionally resonant ideas, regardless of their factual basis. This has sort of become an accepted, almost expected mechanism in our society, and it arguably accelerates the acceptance of post-truth thinking by making the creation and circulation of appealing realities so easy and pervasive. And this, in turn, incrementally erodes the very institutions that fundamentally rely on objective, verifiable, factual truth.
Okay, so we've talked about these big societal forces, media filters, economic logic shaping what's perceived as real on a grand scale. But let's bring it down to a more personal, individual level. How does power influence our own realities, the very experience of our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, what's really fascinating here, and quite sobering, is the idea that while reality is subjective to some extent for everyone, it's not equally subjective. It's deeply shaped by one's place in the world, their social position, their identity. In societies where wealth and power are highly concentrated, which is most societies, really a relatively small fraction of society holds the power to define what is real and what is not real. And the rest are often left navigating a reality that's largely been defined for them by others' rules and perspectives.
Can you give us a kind of concrete example of how that plays out, where someone's personal lived reality is essentially negated or overwritten?
Sure, certainly. Consider the subtle but really impactful example of microaggressions. It comes up a lot in discussions about race. Imagine, say, a black man and his white friend go out to a restaurant together, and maybe the waiter consistently addresses only the white friend, gives him the wine list, asks him to approve the order, looks to him for payment. Now, when the black man maybe quietly observes this pattern, points out this potential bias later, his perception, his racial reality of that situation might get negated. Maybe by the waiter if confronted, oh, I don't mean anything by it, or sometimes even by his own friend. Are you sure? I didn't notice anything. Maybe you're being oversensitive. In that moment, those in positions of power, even the subtle power of reflecting dominant societal norms and perspectives, impose their reality. They define the experience, often dismissing the other person's lived truth as invalid, as oversensitivity or paranoia, rather than acknowledging potential discrimination.
Wow. So denying someone's reality like that, it's almost like denying their very place in the world, denying their authentic self.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. It forces individuals from marginalized groups to constantly conform to the ideals and expectations of the dominant group just to get by. Or think about someone having to hide their sexual orientation for fear of jeopardizing their career, for instance. That's living under an imposed reality. They are often compelled, just for sheer survival or success, to develop a really deep, nuanced understanding of the mindset, the biases, the expectations of their potential oppressors or those in power, whereas individuals from dominant groups, they rarely, if ever, need to understand the mindset or the reality of marginalized groups to succeed or even just to navigate the world comfortably. It creates this really profound, deeply asymmetric burden of perception and understanding.
Definitely feels like a very fluid, maybe even treacherous landscape out there right now when it comes to truth and reality. Very challenging. So what can we do? What practical steps can we take as individuals, maybe as a society, to navigate this better? Or maybe even to, preserve the very idea of truth itself?
Well, the good news is interventions do exist. And they target both the general public and those who are already, perhaps deeply entrenched in conspiracy beliefs or alternative realities. For the general public, things like promoting general analytical thinking skills helps, providing clear, accessible, factual rebuttals to misinformation, Rigorous fact-checking is key, and something called inoculation theory, or pre-bunking basically, warning people in advance about potential misleading tactics or information they might encounter that can be quite effective too. Also, anything that reduces those underlying feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, or powerlessness can help, as those feelings often fuel the search for simplistic, conspiratorial answers.
Okay, that makes sense for general prevention. But what about for those folks who are already deep down the rabbit hole, who are, as you said, often incredibly resistant to new information that contradicts their beliefs? That sounds like a much tougher challenge.
It is. It's significantly harder because their beliefs are often, as we discussed, epistemically self-insulated. They're protected from contrary evidence. So the approach really has to shift. It's less about direct confrontation with facts, which often backfires. Instead, it involves strategies like using trusted messengers, people who the believer already respects or identifies with. It might involve affirming their value for critical thinking, because often they do see themselves as critical thinkers, but gently trying to redirect that critical lens toward their own sources or beliefs. And perhaps most importantly, demonstrating genuine empathy, not attacking them with ridicule or aggressive deconstruction, which just makes them dig their heels in deeper. The goal is often more modest, to provide a potential exit ramp from those beliefs, one that doesn't involve total humiliation, and trying to gently break their informational isolation by encouraging exposure to diverse sources of knowledge, different perspectives, maybe even just different social connections.
So stepping back a bit, what's the sort of core, overarching strategy for preserving truth in this post-truth world? Especially with digital media constantly churning out meaning manufacture and making it harder and harder to discern what's actually real.
Ultimately, I think it comes back to the concept of verification. That is the core function of truth, isn't it? Establishing what corresponds to reality. So we desperately need improved, maybe new forms of verification in the digital age. Some people are exploring ideas like factuality indices, perhaps using AI and big data analysis, almost like a thermometer you could apply to assertions online to gauge their likely truthfulness. The fundamental goal has to be to prevent or counter the pollution of our shared informational environment, clean up the information ecosystem, and ultimately maintaining a truly open society, one with many diverse, independent sources of reliable information and, crucially, credible government sources is probably our primary defense. Which, of course, puts a huge onus on governments themselves to avoid dishonest actions, to be transparent, and to earn back public trust where it's been lost. So just to recap, we've journeyed through quite a bit today. We've touched on the philosophical debate around objective reality itself, Orwell's really chilling warnings about denying it. We looked at the powerful mechanisms of media influence, like the propaganda model, and the complex psychology and impact of conspiracy theories. We explored how capitalism's relentless meaning manufacture might contribute to our current post-truth condition. And we considered the very personal, often unequal experience of whose reality actually gets defined as real in our society.
Yeah, it's become incredibly clear, I think, that in this age of just constant information overload, being able to discern truth is more crucial than it's ever been. It's a fundamental skill for navigating the world. So here's something for you, our listener, to perhaps mull over as you go about your day. Given how deeply intertwined power and knowledge really are in shaping what we all believe to be true, and given the ever-evolving, incredibly rapid nature of information in our digital age, how can you personally best cultivate your own framework of understanding? How can you build your own toolkit to better discern truth and, just as importantly, protect your own mental landscape from manipulation? What specific tools or habits will you use to verify the information you encounter? And perhaps just as significantly, whose realities, whose lived experiences different from your own, will you consciously strive to understand and validate in your own life?